Hello, this is Truth Be Told Transformation, and I'm Bonnie Burkert, here to share tools for transformation to live your highest truth. What is true for me is that I believe in life after life. I believe in reincarnation. I was at a party one time, and I met a young Catholic priest. He'd just been in seminary, and I wanted to talk to him about what his belief system was. And he asked me the question, well, do you have any proof in reincarnation? And I didn't. I just knew. So for the show today, I've invited two gentlemen on who can talk to us a little bit more about proof about life after life. Welcoming Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry. Hello.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.
Right on. Absolutely.
Hey, thanks, Bonnie. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks. And when I was telling them we were doing the little pre-show, I said, look, let's just let the conversation flow about this subject that affects us all, right? I mean, there isn't one person that doesn't have questions about life beyond. So
I think it's on everyone's mind every day.
You know, it really strangely is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I want to tee up your book. So let's go ahead and show that cover here for our YouTube viewers and talk about it's called Proof. The book is Proof of Life After Life. So who's going to take this to start to tell us a little bit about what's going to be in this book and why people want to have this?
Well, can I kind of introduce the book and how we came to write it? And
Thanks, Paul. Yes, please do.
Then Raymond can take over for the rest of the hour.
No.
Well, Raymond and I have worked together for over 3 decades on what we consider to be near-death studies and death studies in general. And throughout the years, of course, we've looked a lot at near-death experiences because Raymond first researched them, he'd name them and define them. So he's considered the father of near-death studies. And we looked at near-death experiences for years. And in the course of dealing with stories about near-death experiences, we've run into different types of stories. And one of those are some that we categorize under the category of shared death experiences. And a shared death experience is when a person who is well experiences the death events of a person who is dying. So in other words, if we're in a hospital with our grandmother and she starts to die and she talks about being out of her body, that's a shared death experience because we're there with her. It's even more of a shared death experience if we start to experience the sensation of being out of body and possibly going into a different room in the hospital and being able to recall conversations with other people. So anyway, Raymond and I collected all these shared death experiences over the years, and then we decided to start to categorize them. And what we've done for this book is we've categorized them into essentially 7 different categories of shared death experiences. Shared death experiences are really, I think, confirmation of consciousness separating from the body. And that happens under a variety of different conditions. And so we selected 7. One is shared death experiences that take place during out-of-body experiences. Another one is precognitive experiences, people who maybe dream someone's death and it turns out to be true, or they see that person as an apparition and they say that I've just died, and they're maybe at a distance and you find out that they died at the same time they appeared to you. Another reason we believe in shared death experiences as being afterlife experiences is they have a way of transforming us. If we share the light, or if we have a light experience with somebody who's dying, it's transforming. It changes us for the rest of our entire life. We've run into cases where there's spontaneous healings, spontaneous muses, if you will, people who acquire angels that they can call upon for help when they need them, and they acquire those through death experiences. we can observe that as outside observers, as well as we can observe it if we had it happen to us. And people who sometimes when they're dying, they light up brightly, or there's a mist that emanates from their body. And that's a shared death experience because people who are around them can see that light, or they can see that mist emitting from the body. And then we have another reason, which we'll deal with later. They're called the psychomantium. And that's something that Raymond developed maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, I did a little bit of reading about that, so we'll come back around to this. Well, yeah. I mean, it feels like each one of the 7 topics that you described could be a show in and of itself. I mean, there's a lot to unload here, very much. So, Raymond, you have been studying this for a very long time. Paul, you mentioned that you two know each other for a while. But, Dr. Raymond, you wrote a seminal book on the subject already back in the 70s, correct?
Right. Life After Life. And, Bonnie, you may not know this, but the title of your program is astonishingly apropos to the topic of near-death experiences and life after death. Because, number one, as you sense too, this society, as a lot of people have kind of abandoned that notion of truth. Namely, that certain things are the case independently of what anybody happens to think or believe or perceive about. And that notion it's as I've observed from my own kids learn that notion about the age of 3, is that they realize that some things are the case no matter what anybody thinks, and that's truth. But because we acquire it so early, we assume it's literally prehistoric, but no way. But the notion of truth and correspondingly, oddly, the notion of proof, deductive proof, was brought to this world, as he puts it, by a Greek philosopher named Parmenides. And apparently, Greeks had these institutions known as oracles of the dead, where you went and they had certain ways of preparing you to see apparitions of the deceased. And these places operated in various ways. Well, Parmenides, as archaeological discoveries indicate, was regarded in his town as a iatromantis, which is a physician prophet. And apparently, from what we know about him, part of his work had to do with going into the next life, which they thought of as the underworld. And the early, even at the time of Plato, if you would ask a person on the street in Athens, what is a philosopher? That person would say the philosopher is a person who probes into things up in the air, namely magical flying or out-of-body experience, or probes into things under the earth, which was a euphemism for life after death, or the underworld. And very paradoxically, there was no such thing as a notion of truth before there was writing. And I won't, and the reason is, that the first inkling that people will have that some things are the case independently of what anybody thinks about it is in connection with the process we call deduction, which we learned very early in life. If Andy is taller than Bill, first premise, and second premise is if Bill is taller than Charlie, then the conclusion is Andy is taller than Charlie. It doesn't matter what anybody thinks or believes, if those two things are true. But before there was writing, people couldn't hold these things in their mind long enough to see the necessary connection to the conclusion. But once they could start writing things down, then they could look on the page and they say, oh, just a minute, if this here is and this here is then this here must also be But they had no word for it. And the person who solved that was Parmenides. And he said, he was on one of his trips to the underworld, he was abducted by a goddess who sang him a song, which is the very first written out logical deduction. And so she said, when you go back to Earth, Parmenides, don't tell people to believe this because the goddess says so. Tell them to work it out in their own minds and see it for themselves. So when he came back, he got his students to recite this until they learned it by heart. And when they did, they will see that necessary connection between premises and conclusion, that it takes it out of the world of human opinion, and just like it doesn't matter what anybody thinks, that's the way it is. And that's the notion of truth. It took another 100 years, by the way, for Plato to think, just a minute here, just as there are some sentences that are the case no matter what anybody thinks, so there are other sentences that are not the case, no matter what. And Plato formulated the notion of falsehood and truth and falsehood and the contrast. See, so my point is, according to its author, Parmenides, the notion of truth which we have, which we absorb by the time we're about 3 years old, came here from the other side. So life after death is a lot more interconnected with even the basic concepts that we use every day than we ordinarily realize. So, I mean, that's a long-winded talk, I know, but I mean, I just thought I think it's so appropriate that your show is Truth Be Told.
Well, I think this is
and that
so
truth
great.
itself is a notion that came here from the other side.
Fantastic. I mean, that's almost if you will, a little sidebar to our conversation. And I really appreciate you giving some perspective on truth. And you're a philosopher as well as a psychiatrist. Is that correct?
That's
so
right.
You give us a beautiful little taste and I mean, really, truly the history of these words. But we're tying, and then perfectly ties back into how the ancients did look at death, and it was part of their life, like an understanding and a survey of it. And I wonder why it changed, and maybe it's I guess with various religions that there needed to be that middleman to usher us yonder, beyond this life.
Well, Paul, I don't know.
I don't know. It has been used as a marketing tool by religion, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Afterlife.
Exactly said. No, it's really true.
One thing that impresses me is that the afterlife is becoming manifest in this life in a whole new way. By which I mean, and what I think the shifting event was the development of cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Okay.
And up to that time, there were plenty of near-death experiences, historically, but they were very rare because, the average fate of somebody who looked dead was that they would go on and be dead. But the shift in technology, created an enormous number of people who had been to the brink of death and returned and could tell us these stories. And that's why, I'm just sort of a little bit uncomfortable. People are always patting me on the back and, talking about the brilliance of my observation and my so-called courage in bringing this to light. But I did it with the full realization that I had lectured at all these civic clubs, and everywhere I went, people, that happened to me, and would tell me their stories. So, and because of this acceleration that happened, because of the CPR, we are seeing a huge number of people that part of their life experience has been spent on the other side. And I've noticed, and you're not in a position to notice this yet, Bonnie, but Paul and I certainly are, is that you get to a certain age in life, and it turns like that practically everybody you know who's your age has had some kind of experience which they seemed, from their point of view, to step over into some other reality.
Yeah, I've tested that a few times. I have this thing I do called the Dennys experiment. And I did it first when it was 20 or 30 years ago, and we first started writing together. I went to a movie with some friends, and it was late at night. We stopped at Dennys, and they asked what I was working on. And so I told them about near-death experiences. And a couple of them at the table said, well, I don't believe in that. And so I was a little drunk, and it was after a movie. And I stood up in this Dennys, and there were probably 20 or 30 people in the Dennys. And I said, excuse me. I told them what I was working on, described a near-death experience, and said, how many people in here have had one or know someone who has had one? No one thought it was a foolish thing to do. And for the most part, almost everybody had a comment. They all had comments, and many of them had stories. Some had had heart attacks. Some had been in the military and had been wounded in war, and 2 or 3 of the people had grandparents who had died and had out-of-body experiences and talked about them. Out of about 20 to 30 people there were about 15 stories that arose from that. Yeah. And you can try that yourself. You don't even have to be in a Dennys. You can bring it up in a crowd of people. A number of people think it's just foolish, but a number will say, well, I've heard that, or I've had it happen to me. And that's how common these things are now. But how seldom they're talked about. Yeah. Unless people are smart to do it.
People want to focus on this life. A lot of people are still afraid of death, and everybody, what is fear of death? I get a lot of people, as a psychiatrist over the years, talking to me about their fear of death. And I quickly realized you got to, which particular fear of death? Mine is pain. I'm not scared of death, but I don't want any pain in the process, yes, right?
Agreed.
Other people are just afraid of, afraid of being annihilated, fear of nothingness. Some people are afraid of the unknown. Some people are afraid of hell. Some people are afraid of, separation from their loved ones and such. But what I've noticed in the course of this, what I've seen develop over the last 50 years is that what's entering the picture now is like Paul was saying, that everybody essentially knows somebody who's been over to the other side. And so that creates a whole difficulty, by the way, which is worth exploring, and the so-called skeptics, or, I'm the skeptic about this. Well, sadly, most people who use that word have no idea what it means. What it means really is, it's from the Greek philosopher Pyrrho, who said, let's try just not drawing a conclusion. Let's think out things very rigorously and rashly, but then refrain from drawing a conclusion. Because they noticed it expanded their minds, and also because it enabled them to see things that everybody else had missed by focusing in one way, by looking to the side. But what the skeptics, all the great skeptics, David Hume, Pyrrho, have pointed out, that that kind of attitude doesn't interfere with your daily life. Because, as David Hume was very social, he made his way to the dinner parties. And you just go on living your life like everybody else when you're a skeptic. But what I've seen now is that even the skeptic in that sense, who just says, well, despite all my rational thinking here, I'm just going to go and live this life of convention and custom. But now the convention and custom of this life is, there are people in it who have been over there and back. It's just totally, I think, altered the kind of psycho-spiritual landscape these experiences have over the last 50 years, I think.
Well, we should have Raymond describe his own shared death experience, actually.
Thank you. And I would like to thank you both for citing these examples of talking to people and where people are at. That was definitely one of the questions that I had, because I know that it was a while back now that you've written your first book, and what the acceptance of it all is. So I'll ask you that as you do describe how this all started for you and your own personal experiences, both of you. Dr. Raymond?
Well, my own personal experience with this actually goes back to childhood, in which I just realized very early in life that I was never going to know much of anything because I was an astronomer. And also realizing in a way that this world didn't make any sense, which is okay with me because I love Dr. Seuss, Lewis Carroll. So when I came up with my first in real contact with the notion of an afterlife as a serious topic, since my family wasn't religious when I was very young, my first real contact was in Plato at 18 years old, and I just didn't know what to make of it, as it seemed. But I knew from very early from my philosophy professor that these experiences were known in very early times, and that Plato looked at them as indicators of an afterlife. But his rough contemporary, the philosopher Democritus, had figured out that things are made up of tiny little bits called atoms. And Democritus, writing on this, said there's no such thing as a moment of death. Said what these experiences are, they represent the residual biological activity in the body even after the body appears dead. That's the classical debate. See, that's how people argue about it today. But I never fell for that for two reasons, actually. One, the more important philosophical reason, but having to do with the mind-body relationship. But the more practical reason was that even my first year in medical school, one of my own professors, Martha McCraney, who's a psychiatry professor, told me about her shared death experiences, as we now call them, when she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother. And Professor McCraney had all these same things that we hear of, like she felt she left her body. She saw this light in the passageway and saw the spirit of her now deceased mother receding into this pathway. Saw the scene from above of her down below and her mother. It was, and I've heard lots of these. Well, I had been investigating these a long time, and it was in 1994 that Paul and I were actually getting ready to write about this. I remember one thing we went to out in Scottsdale, where there's a lot of people, and in that small audience, there were, I think, 15 or so people who had these shared death experiences. So that was all going on. And what drives me, by the way, is curiosity all my life. And so we were sort of gearing up to do this book. And then, of all things, my mother died, and my family and I had one of these experiences while she was in her death process. And from my point of view, the room, a hospital room is like a cube, right? But when my mother was dying, I was not in any cube. I was in a double funnel. I don't know what to say this. It's like the room changed configuration, and there was an energy in it, and the light changed tone. It was just some other kind of light than what comes from a light bulb or an LED or the sun. And my mother said twice, "I love you," but I didn't hear it through my ears. I give up in terms of time. Other people, my sister saw that my father, who had died 18 months before she felt his presence there. All these things that you read about. And so, what that did actually was hearing this is one thing, which is very wonderful and profound, and experiencing it is another, which is very profound, but on a different level. And in terms of my process, it took me a while to integrate this. So it took another few years for me to unscramble my worldview, having experienced this, so that I could, and that Paul and I went ahead and wrote about it, because, it is baffling. People have a standard way of thinking about near-death experiences, and so it makes them less scary, right? Number one, a near-death experience typically happens to the other person, right? It tells you this story, okay? And so that you can distance it. And also it gives you this excuse, well, it was just his brain being oxygen, and without even thinking that through, it nonetheless gives people comfort of some sort, so that they won't have to face the challenge that maybe they don't know as much as we
Exactly.
think, right? And so that shared death experiences throws a crimp in all of that, because it's something that happens not to somebody who dies, but to somebody who is there when somebody else does, and who is not ill or injured. So there's no question of oxygen deprivation to the brain. So what in the world do we make of this? Well, Bonnie, you obviously from your profession, and Paul from his, and me from mine, we are curious people who love to think. But I suspect that all of our intuitions sort of come to the same on this, which astonishingly, there are so many people out there who don't seem to have any curiosity and who don't want to think, and they want it prepackaged. And that is why I think that these shared death experiences they haven't sunk in yet in people's minds like the NDEs have. But they will, because what happens, and it's like you're in a room of 100 people, you ask how many have experienced this, you're going to get a show of hands.
Yes, indeed. I think that it's hard for me to understand why people wouldn't be open to this. I mean, doesn't it feel better to think that there is life beyond?
I have a strong opinion about that, Bonnie. And I know that's the thing people say. It's like even these so-called skeptics. I was on some program with one of these guys just a few years ago, and at the end he said, we all would want there to be an afterlife.
Exactly.
And I say that's bunk. My best friend of 30 years was a guy named Milton Friedman, not the economist. My Milton was a speechwriter, worked for the Senate, worked for President Ford. I mean, he's just more into that world. But Milton, he and I knew each other for 30 years, and he saw this develop with me, and really getting to a point where, it finally builds to the point where you just say, I give up. I can't think my way out of this. Yeah. And Milton was reaching that point. And I was with him in Washington one day, and I remember when it came to his mind, and he said, I hope not. And the fact is, there are a lot of people who don't want there to be an afterlife. As a matter of fact, one of the formative books of Western thought was called On Nature by Lucretius, who was an atomist. And it begins with the whole point of atomism, from this Democritus and others, was that you don't have to worry about an afterlife. Just relax, enjoy this life. Because, people are so terrified, as many still are. See, many people who were this hell thing was drilled into him. And, I've known people like that. And Milton, that wasn't his case. In his case, it was just seeing so much suffering in World War II, I think, that he didn't want there to be an afterlife. But for others, it's, they get indoctrinated by these, moronic ranters in churches. And they're terrified. And so I've seen a lot of people who come to me over the years in that state of mind. And because the religion had so poisoned their mind that they don't want there to be an afterlife. See, I mean, they just don't want to think about this. Because, to them it means hell. And so, people have all kinds of attitudes.
Right, some sort of responsibility, for beyond. So, Paul, let me ask you, how did you come to this? How did you find each other? Had you read Dr. Raymonds' book, knowing his work from long ago, or did you find each other through other means? What was your experience?
Through other means, actually. I was editing American Health magazine in New York, and my book agent, Nat Sobel, was also Raymond's book agent. And he approached me one day, he took me out to lunch, and he said, would you like to work on a book with Raymond Moody? And I said, I don't know who Raymond Moody is. And he said, well, he named and defined the near-death experience. I said, I don't know what that is. I mean, I was the editor of a major health magazine and had no idea what a near-death experience was. And I would say that most of the editors with me didn't know anything about it at all either. And Nat says, well, maybe you should get a little more educated and work on a book with Raymond. And so I got together with Raymond in Georgia. I flew down from New York, and we went to work on a book called The Light Beyond, which was a book that was written 10 years after Life After Life.
Or 12 years after, or 14 years after.
Yeah, it was like 14 years after. We wanted to look at his work compared to all the large body of research that had accumulated over those 14 years. And it was in the course of that I basically got a working course in near-death experiences. And we finished The Light Beyond, and I said, there's a major gap in this book, and that is that there's nothing in it about children and children in near-death experiences. And Raymond says, well, there's been really no research done on that except by one guy, and that's a doctor in Seattle named Melvin Morse. And he introduced me to Melvin, and then I was off on the rest of my career. Every time I'd write a book, I wrote a book with Mel called Closer to the Light, and it was about children and near-death experiences. But then when we finished it, I said, well, what's the long-term effect of near-death experiences on people? And he said, I don't know. And the next thing you know, he launched this whole transformation study where we looked at hundreds of people who had had near-death experiences and looked at how it would affect them literally over the decades. And we did a book called Transformed by the Light. So Closer to the Light was a bestseller. Transformed by the Light was a bestseller. And then I had other questions based on that. And I would convince Melvin to write a book about, I forget what our next book was, Where God Lives, I think it was where in the brain could God exist? Could God be? And we did that book. Then we got back together and did a book on reunions, where we did this book on the psychomantium, which I thought was absolutely the craziest idea I had ever heard.
But yeah, please tell us what that is.
Yeah. Well, Raymond, as you know from talking to him, he's a Greek historian. That's one way to put it. And he studied much of the culture of the Greeks, as well as their attitudes and their deep thoughts. And he came across these things called psychomantions that the Greeks had. And it was where the Greeks would make connection with the dead. They would spend a considerable amount of time in darkness and in in caves. And when they would get, in my estimation, kind of desensitized, sometimes they would spend, weeks in these caves?
It was 29 days.
29 days.
Okay.
In a completely dark
like
cave.
one of those 28-day programs.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And at the end of the 29th day, they were in another place, put it that way. They were desensitized. They were mentally in a different place. And they would take them into a big room, and in the middle of this room would be a brass cauldron. And the cauldron would be filled with water. It would be heated, and it was steaming. And they would go in there with these priests, and they would gaze into the water. This is after 29 days, and all of a sudden they're resensitized. And they would then see departed loved ones. They would get answers to any questions that they had. Sometimes these departed loved ones would come out of the cauldron and walk around the room. And everyone thought that was just a primitive thing to do, anyone who knew about it, except Raymond. And Raymond decided that he could revive this practice, and it could be used for a number of things. It could be used for psychotherapy. It could be used for grief. It could be used to find your car keys. And so he created a psychomantium in his own house. I think your first one was in Alabama.
Yeah.
He had a big mill house on the Chocolaca Creek, and he took this whole room and built a mirror room. And people would go in. I'm simplifying it here. They would go in after a long stint with Raymond, who would acclimate them to opening up to the other side, essentially. And then they would go into the mirror room, gaze into the mirrors, and they would see their departed loved ones. And sometimes it was quite intense. And then sometimes it was nothing at all. But then later, when they returned to the hotel and the sun went down and they were laying in bed, the departed loved ones would appear to them. And they would appear so vividly that they could actually touch one another, hold one another. And there's several cases where people said they were picked up by their departed loved ones and hugged.
And this sounds so crazy. It sounds so crazy.
It's incredible.
The trouble is, it does happen. The funniest thing to me about this in retrospect was that the way I knew about this was from reading it in ancient manuscripts, and even in the Middle East today, they still do this. They take the silver bowl, they polish it on the inside, fill it with water and a layer of olive oil, and in the dark room by candlelight, there would be chants or formulae like to bring up the dead.
Interesting.
And and it made sense to me that this would happen because I already knew about this effect of mirror gazing, where I had used this with my students for years and accessing their unconscious and so on. And so, it just all made sense. So I recruited my graduate students of psychology at first. Soon enough, there was a psychologist friend, a psychiatrist friend, a sociology professor, an anesthesia, just like medical colleagues and friends who said, well, I want to do it too. So we set out, and I remember thinking specifically, Bonnie, that if I did 50 of these, I'd probably get 5 cases and I could write a report. And also I assumed that since these were educated people who were aware of, had studied the human mind, that if they saw anything, they would say something like, oh yeah, I saw an image in the mirror, it looked like grandma, but was it real or a figment of mine? I don't know. That was what I was expecting. Imagine my surprise when the very first woman who did this, who was 44 years old, who was back for further education in psychology. She had been for a long time a drug and alcohol rehab counselor. And anybody who knows that profession knows that those people are pretty, their feet are on the ground.
Right.
And she came out of there saying, she went in there prepared to see her husband who had died 2 years before. But the person who showed up instead was her father, who not just appeared in the mirror, but stepped out of the mirror, and which often happens. And then when she went back to the hotel that evening, she said again, he appeared. As she was lying in bed, he appeared again. And she said, incidentally, who I wanted to see was my father. The person when reflecting on it, the person I needed to see was, I wanted to see my husband. The person I needed to see was my father. And so, I've just done, I guess, a couple of hundred of these by now. And some people say that they themselves, their consciousness goes through the mirror into another realm of existence, and it's there they meet and converse with their dead relatives. About 30% of the people actually hear it as an audible voice, like an auditory sensation. The other 70% generally say there was a communication, but it was not in sound. It was by heart to heart or mind to mind. Some people say that they see in addition to, or rather than, the person they set out to see, some other deceased relative, including, in one case, a young woman who was a psychologist who saw her great-grandmother who had died before she was born. Although it makes sense in terms of the family dynamics, because this great-grandmother was kind of a family legend. But what I'm saying here is that this is, this is startling information. And why don't we know about it? Well, in a way we do. If you go back into the Victorian era, this was a matter of common sense knowledge. Everybody knew this. That they would have, I've seen a lot of postcards and graphic art where in the Victorian times, where people would assemble in front of the mirror, and by candlelight they would go, and you would see the spirits come out of the mirror. So people knew about this, and I think what happened in a word was radio and then TV, because in the 20s people started sitting around the radio rather than looking into the mirror, and then watching the automatic mirror of television. And so it just dropped out. But it has been throughout history. This is many, many cultures have discovered this. And yet what I find so paradoxical about this, Bonnie and Paul, is, how many people do you hear say, if I only had 5 more minutes, when they're talking about a lost loved one? Well, that is remarkably easy to do. Oh. But there is, for some reason, one thing that brought about the demise of this was the church that in the 4th century forbade it. But the reason they forbade it was that it was a practice in the church up to then. As a professor of religious studies at Cambridge sent me a communication years ago talking about this. But then it gets rediscovered, and so this is something that it's still kind of hard to figure why this hasn't sunk in yet with people, except that, it's kind of hard to hold on to this world that we're in, because it's, as soon as you start thinking, you realize how unreal this place is.
But people aren't doing the thinking, is what you were pointing out.
Right.
And possibly you said there's the distractions of TV and radio, and I hope that, truth be told, transformation is not a distraction, but we're really here to educate. And I think
TV
that
is a great method.
You both are doing incredible work to open people up. And what I'm hearing is that you're reaching people that may not otherwise be thinking about maybe even forms of meditation, what you were describing. I mean, I feel like some of the work that you're doing, this staring into the water, the mirror, I mean, that's a form of divination? Isn't that like called scrying in some other disciplines?
It is, but what's interesting and what takes it way past ordinary meditation is a case that took place, 5 years ago? The woman who came from Argentina.
Oh, yeah.
And she came to the Psychomanteum to see her daughter. She went to see her daughter who had died like 90 days before of cancer. And so she came with her sister. And she went to Raymonds Psychomanteum, and she went into the vision chamber, I'll call it that. And nothing happened. She was in there for quite some time, and nothing happened. She couldn't see her daughter, just nothing happened. And so she went back to the hotel with her sister, and they were sitting, it was 3:30 in the afternoon. They were sitting in their room talking about what had taken place and how much she wished she had seen her daughter. And suddenly three orbs came into the room, and they floated around the room, and luckily her sister photographed them. And so we have photos of these three orbs, and this makes it truly objective. Up to this point, most of the cases are subjective because one person experiences them, and there's no other actual witness to see them. But here's these photographs of these orbs moving around the room, and the woman eventually starts talking to one of the orbs, and she says that her daughter was in the orb.
Oh, and see, these are incredible cases.
And this is what makes the Psychomanteum, in my estimation, an objective experience, one that has actual, more than one person evidence associated with it. I always wanted Raymond to put some kind of a camera in the chamber, but being a good doctor, he wouldn't do that. But there were so many cases. He worked with Joan Rivers.
Yeah.
And Joan Rivers saw and spoke to her husband, and came out of the chamber weeping.
Oh.
Uncontrollably. He did it once on Oprah. Oprah set it all up, and these people had very similar experiences.
It's powerful. I mean, these are very specific examples that you're giving, and a practice in all of this. So, again, we're going to kind of wrap here with, maybe some parting thoughts. The book, again, is called Proof of Life, Afterlife, and you've got quite a body of work between the two of you on this subject. And I feel that the momentum has to be on your side, as far as more and more people being open to this and wanting and knowing that this is. Don't shut it down. There's no reason to not believe.
Yeah. Well, people want to go the extra step. They want to go the step beyond near-death experiences now, because many people, if not everybody, is familiar with near-death experiences. And this takes it the extra step. This takes it into an objective realm. And it also shows that it happens under different circumstances than just near-death experiences. The really neat thing about this book is that we have so many doctors. There was a time when doctors wouldn't touch this subject. And that's all changed now in the last less than 10 years, where now doctors are younger, they're more open. They've heard more from older doctors that the older doctors wouldn't talk about earlier. And they've experienced more, and they're willing to talk about it. And
Fantastic.
So that has advanced this field quite a bit. Is you have doctors, medical doctors, who are willing to talk about it and willing to try to research. So, yeah, we're taking huge steps with this book.
Dr. Raymond, there's some incredible stories you've shared with us. Thank you so much. I mean, you've taken it from the ancients to current day, and again, just sort of looking at people's understanding of the possibility that it's not just over when we die. And I don't know, as somebody who believes, I'm a longtime student of yoga, and it's about energy for me. I mean,
Sure.
why wouldn't this energy just transform into something else? I mean, I feel like that's such a real possibility. I'm not saying I'm coming back and being, the president of the U.S. in the next life or any such. That's not where I'm at with it. I think it's just about energy and really knowing that can shine on, as one of my favorite sayings. So I think you're doing some incredible work, and we're really grateful for that and all the stories you've shared.
Well, thank you so much, Bonnie, and I just appreciate this. And thanks also for all the people watching in. I know that just observed, as we all have in the last couple of years, 1 million extra Americans died from the epidemic, and also just with aging, people get more interested in this. So I mean, I just find this stuff fascinating, and I hope that what we've had to say has helped some of the folks listening in.
I'm sure. Give us your website once again.
lifeafterlife.com.
That's great, so people know how to find you. Thank you so much to both of you, Dr. Raymond, Paul Perry. It was wonderful to speak with you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you so much.
Until the next time.
Take care.
Well, everybody, this has really been a fascinating conversation, and truly we are about higher consciousness here, and that is what Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry were sharing with us today. So thank you again to the both of them for giving us some incredible insight to this. I am Bonnie Burkert here with shows that, again, are tools for transformation, and we hope that you will get something from this, and be sure to share it with your friends when you do. Don't forget that Tony Sweet has his show on live Fridays at 3 p.m. Pacific, and as well as Robert Hensley with the Minuteman Report with weekly shows as well. Thanks for everyone for sharing the light, and we'll see you in the next episode.
I'm going to call you, okay?
You're gonna what?
I'm going to give you a call.
Oh, okay. So we close this out?
I think it's all over.
Oh, okay. That was good. She was very nice.
Yeah, she's good.